Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Ellen Reese, an Associate Professor of Scandinavian Studies. Ellen Reese earned her BA at Evergreen State College. She earned her MA and her PhD in Scandinavian Languages and Literature at the University of Washington. She came to the University of Oregon in 2004. Her research interests include modern prose and contemporary cinema. She is the author of the book On the Margins, Nordic Women Modernists of the 1930s, published in 2005. She has just finished a book manuscript which is in press, Figurative Space, in the novels of Cora Sandell. She is working on another book, a collection of essays on contemporary Norwegian cinema. Welcome.
Thank you.
Or Velkommen, or
Very good.
how do you say?
Velkommen.
Oh, okay. I was close.
Yeah.
I was close. Okay. So tell me how you became interested in Scandinavian studies.
Well, it's a long story. It goes back to early days for me. But I was primarily interested in studying a foreign language, and the only one available that I knew of in my hometown was Norwegian through the Sons of Norway Hall.
And now, what hometown was that?
Bellingham, Washington.
And
then I was an exchange student, a Rotary youth exchange student to Norway, and it just sort of snowballed.
Took it from there.
Yeah.
So let's see. So that was, did you say, and so when did you begin Norwegian? How old were you?
13.
How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's unusual.
Strange
you knew
kid.
a lot of Norwegian. No, I mean you knew a lot of Norwegian when you got to college.
Yeah.
It's probably very rare, except for native speakers, to
Yeah.
have that sort of knowledge.
Yeah.
So you started off with, now which language? With Norwegian, and then you went on to.
I have studied Finnish and lived in Finland, and I've studied Swedish in Sweden as well.
Right. So which is the hardest? Finnish is supposed to be really tough.
Yeah.
How's your Finnish now?
Very poor,
Uh-huh.
unfortunately. I can do enough to supervise the GTF, the teaching assistant that we have in Finnish, and help her with her first and second year classes, but I really am not very fluent, and I don't do research in that area.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why they have such a small population. You have to be a genius to speak the language. Now, tell us about Scandinavian studies at the U of O. How long has it been around, and what's given it its impetus? Because we have some good people.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story actually, because Scandinavian Studies as a program at the University of Oregon was started by public initiative. You had a group of people out in the community, primarily people of Scandinavian descent, who petitioned the state legislature and the Board of Regents to start a program, to solidify a program. They'd been offering courses in the various Nordic languages, but they didn't have a program. So in 1913, actually, this petition came through and was approved. So as far as I know, it's the only program in the state that's actually by public initiative, and we're really proud of that sort of grassroots history that we have.
From 1913.
Yeah.
And so how big a pool of people were involved in it then, and how about now?
I don't know the exact numbers, but I think that the petition was a pretty solid number of people. And the interesting thing is that it was sort of all walks of life. You had wealthy industrialists, and you had poor loggers and farmers and fishermen signing the petition. And so it really represented what a strong place Scandinavia had, or people of Scandinavian descent had in Oregon's early history.
So do you go to the Scandinavian Festival, or do you have?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about the involvement of the program in the festival, and how long the festival. Do you know how long the festival's been going on?
I don't know the history of the Junction City Scandinavian Festival. There are, of course, festivals that go on in Astoria, Oregon, and also up in the Portland area. And I know that the Danes have their own events as well. So there's various Scandinavian groups within the larger umbrella of Scandinavia that are the country specific that have organizations. But we have, since I sort of started when I came to the University of Oregon, had a booth at the Junction City Scandinavian Festival to give out information about our program. And it's always surprising to me how few people know that we exist or that we offer our languages, and we offer 4 Nordic languages. So we have the Finnish that we mentioned before, and we have Norwegian, which is what I primarily teach. We have Swedish, and then we have Danish language. And through the English department, we actually offer Old English, or Old Norse.
Old Norse, right.
Which is very similar to Old English.
Right. So in that sense, there are now 5 Scandinavian languages being taught at the University of Oregon. So this is good for our guests to know about that.
Yeah.
hopefully, though, some of them will show up in your classes.
We very much welcome them. We always have community education program students, people who are not degree seeking but who are just interested in one of the languages, who show up in our classes, and they're very welcome.
So let's begin talking about your book on the margins that looks at some Scandinavian women who, for the most part, wrote in the 1930s but weren't considered modernists. So how did you come up with this subject, and who do you hope to read the book?
Everybody.
No, did you? I mean, I think that's a question. I'm sorry, I asked you two questions, so we'll start with the second first. When you write a book like this, which is obviously very particularized, you know, and I don't know how many scholars in the world are really are capable, have the background to be able to evaluate it. But when you write it, are you writing it for those few scholars, or for a more general audience?
Well, to be honest, I was really writing it with scholars of literary modernism and the literature of the interwar period, people who maybe specialize in German or French or British and American literature, to say that, to sort of introduce some new voices into this larger discursive field of modernism that we talk about, this sort of literary and artistic response to the dramatic changes brought about in European civilization after the First World War, and to show that these Scandinavian writers were very much writing in dialogue with writers of other countries, and that they teach us new things about the way that people responded, and particularly women responded to the dramatic social change that was taking place in the 20s and 30s. So I try to write it in a way that's clear enough that someone who has, you know, a basic general liberal arts background would be able to read it. But I really was trying to, it's a little contentious in that I was trying to say, look, there are other people experiencing modernity in similar ways, but also in different ways, and they should be included in our larger discussion so that we really understand the fullness of that period.
So when you talk about on the margins, you're really, in this sense, talking about a literary world that was on the margins of what most people think of modernism. They think of, for our audience, so who are the great modern authors to whom you that have more name recognition, to whom you're comparing your authors? Well,
the one that I actually spend some time analyzing is Virginia Woolf, who's a very well-known woman modernist from England. Other names that people will be familiar with probably are James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, and there's sort of this, if you will, high modernism, but then there was many other people responding in some ways more interesting ways, I would argue, to some of the same problems, more creative ways in some respects. But Virginia Woolf is really the touchstone for the book, and anyone who has enjoyed or is familiar with her authorship, I think, would really, I hope, find something interesting in my analysis of her works and also the works that I compare her to.
So what was it about Woolf, if you could express it to those who may not have read her work, what was it about Woolf that was particularly, that these writers found particularly sympathetic and worth responding to?
I mean, for one thing, I'm really interested in the novel, and these are all novelists or prose writers, either short story or novel writers. And the thing that's so interesting about her is that she's sort of taking apart the conventional narrative plot. She's, you know, the storyline that we all know from movies and from Harlequin romances and other more traditional literature. She's trying to say, what happens if you take apart that plot? What happens? What can you do with the novel as a genre? How can you express these new experiences and feelings that we as a civilization are having, faced with, you know, total warfare and all the things that were changing at that time period? Sort of the old storyline, plotline doesn't really fit to express our trauma of the war, our experience of modernity. So let's take that apart and see what we can put back together in a new way. And all of these writers were also doing similar things.
So they were all inventive in terms of their style, wasn't?
I mean, I shouldn't downplay the quality of 19th century classic novels, you know, George Eliot and the Brontes and the wonderful tradition that we have of the novel. But these people are saying those conventions, those ways of thinking about the world just don't fit anymore because things have changed so radically. So let's try to change the novel to echo our feeling of alienation, for example.
So how did you pick these particular writers then?
They're the best ones.
That's a good criterion.
Yeah. They were all sort of seen as anomalous. They didn't really fit into the literary sort of larger project in each of their countries. They were strange. They weren't doing what everyone else was doing within the context of Scandinavia.
Yeah.
So by taking them out and putting them in with a larger European range of modernists, suddenly they start to make sense as writers.
And this hadn't been done before in your field.
No.
So if that's the case, I mean, how many people would you say really have the competence to evaluate your work? I mean, I guess they could, you know, say, "I read this book, so I better educate myself in this stuff." But you know, in the country or in the world, how many people? Well, let's say in the country here.
Well, there are 9 programs that offer PhDs in Scandinavian studies in the United States, and there's at least 30 universities that offer programs in Norwegian studies particularly. So I would say that, and we have a very active scholarly organization of something like 300 members, so I would say there's at least 300 people.
I see. Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah,
that's pretty good. And were the writers well known before you picked them?
2 of them were.
I see.
The one, Isaac Dinesen, as she's known in the English-speaking world, is a Danish writer who wrote her novels actually, or I'm sorry, her short stories actually in English first and then rewrote them herself in Danish. So she's sort of claimed as an English writer, although she's Danish.
Now what people will recognize her, because I think, wasn't there a famous screenplay based on one of her books?
Yeah, well there's 2 that people might recognize. The first is Out of Africa, which starred Meryl Streep and Robert Redford in the 1980s, and then also Babette's Feast, which was a very popular an Academy Award winning film, and also in the 1980s, that she wrote. It was based on one of her short stories.
And again, which countries do these writers come from? In your book, how many different Scandinavian countries? 4
different countries. So one author from Finland, a couple from Norway, one from Denmark, and a couple from Sweden.
Is that fairly typical in Scandinavian studies to have that kind of range? I somehow can't imagine people necessarily in Scandinavia itself. I mean, is it just sort of common for people to know both Finnish and whatever, Swedish and...
Well, I cheated with the Finn because the writer was a Swedish-speaking Finn.
Oh, I see.
Part of the minority population of Finland, which today is something like 6% of Finland that speaks Swedish. And she wrote her novels in Swedish. So I cheat, but I mean, the Scandinavian languages are mutually intelligible. And by that I mean Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian with goodwill. If they're much closer than, say, the Romance languages. So you don't have to formally study the other language to have access to the other 2.
I see. Well, that's a good secret to know.
Yeah. Icelandic and Finnish are not mutually intelligible. So that it's more of a stretch.
So your next book, Figurative Space in the Novels of Cora Sandell. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Cora Sandell.
Cora Sandell.
Sandell.
Sandell. That's a book that is it right? You've just finished it, or you're close?
Correct.
You just finished it.
Yeah, in March. Yeah.
Well, tell us who the. I'm not going to try to pronounce it again. who the author is and how well known she is at the moment before you've written your book on her.
Before the onslaught of my book. She is very well known in Scandinavia, very little known outside of Scandinavia. And she's a 20th century Norwegian writer. She's born in 1880, and so she sort of bridges the 19th and 20th century in her own personal life. But she debuted quite late in life as a writer, so she debuted at the age of 46, and she started out as a painter, actually, and wrote 5 novels and 5 collections of short stories. And she's one of these writers that's known as a writer's writer, who's very well respected among people who are among the literary types, and sort of kind of a secret passion for people. You either really dig her, or you just think she's boring. And I just happened to fall into the really dig her category. And people, like high school students in Norway that have to read her book, always say, "Oh, that's so boring, nothing happens." And so my job is to say, yeah, nothing happens on the level of the plot, because this author isn't interested in the plot. The plot is irrelevant. What's interesting is the way she plays with levels of time, the way that things, the way that metaphoric elements are connected in really interesting ways.
So, but you talk about figurative space.
Yeah.
And you want to let our audience know, and me, what you mean by that.
Well, there's been a lot of research in the last, 20 years or so in various aspects of space in literature. For a long time, scholars really focused on elements of the plot and elements of time, but what people are more and more looking at is how space functions as an element of fiction. And I mean space quite literally, the landscape, the interiors that the characters move throughout, within the course of the novels. And by using the term figurative, I'm trying to say that the space signifies or connotes something beyond just this is a room, a dining room, or this is a ski trail, or this is a city street. That there's all sorts of information that we can glean about the characters and about the emotional content of the novel through reading the space specifically. Mm-hmm. And I identified certain types of spaces that I think differ, and basically just tried to do a really close reading of space.
So you mentioned that she was a painter, and you would think somebody who was a painter would be interested in this idea of space. And of course there's a whole tradition, I don't know whether you go into it, of painting of poetry, ekphrasis. Ekphrasis.
Yeah.
Do you deal with that all? In other words, ekphrasis for our audience, the painting of a picture in words. Like, I guess the most famous example is Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, in which the poem describes a Greek vase. So
exactly.
Yeah. So tell me. So is this something you talk about in your book?
Absolutely. There's one of her novels in particular is set in Paris in the interwar period, and it's a bunch of artists. It's a woman who's not an artist herself, but she's on the periphery of the artist colony, the expatriate artist colony in Paris, which is, a thrilling environment to be writing about anyway. And so there are many scenes where she depicts the art that's being created around her, but then there's also scenes where she views the world and the narrative voice describes it as if the narrator is describing a painting, even using language that talks about the birch trees. The white bark on the birch trees look like chalk lines in the distance, or some in the landscape. So this ekphrasis or ekphrastic moments sort of show up as spectacles in the text throughout, and so they typically are framed, say in a doorway or a window. So there's sort of a frame as well, and that I relate to this notion of space, because those are points of penetration where you can enter or exit a space. And so interesting things happen at those liminal or transitional spaces of doors and windows.
Were you able to, or were you interested, if your argument led in that direction, to actually put in the book any of her paintings or her artwork?
I don't think her paintings are that good.
Oh, really?
To be honest.
Failed painter.
Yeah.
So the literature is superior to the painting.
Absolutely.
Was the painting modernist in the way that her fiction is modernist?
She was sort of a mildly influenced by early 20th century developments. So she was, she tried, but she didn't really, I don't think she really was able to break free of the conventions of representational art in the way that she was able to break free of the novelistic conventions for whatever reason.
So let's turn now to you just finished this project. I'm sorry to kind of speed you through your career.
No,
you deserve a break. But for the purposes of our interview here, you're working on a book about Norwegian cinema. Is that right?
Well, it's...
Or at least you've got a project on Norwegian cinema.
I actually am weighing two different projects right now. And the one that I've had going, sort of ongoing for a long time, is a collection of essays on Norwegian cinema, because no one writes about Norwegian cinema. People write about Swedish cinema with Ingmar Bergman.
Right.
Now
tell people how to pronounce Bergman's name.
Bergman.
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 Okay, thank you very much.
Bergman. And then, so they write about Bergman, and they write about the Danish Dogma 95 movement, which is this quite recent development in Danish cinema that's sort of a throwback to the French New Wave cinema of the 60s, sort of a similar development in the 90s in Denmark. So that gets a lot of attention, but no one's doing anything with Norwegian cinema. And I'm just trying to see if there's something interesting that I can tease out there.
Well, who are the Norwegian filmmakers and directors? Would people be familiar with them?
Well, there's an interesting tendency of Norwegian filmmakers to have their films remade in Hollywood. So there's a guy named Erik Skjoldberg who did a movie called Insomnia that was put out not too long ago. It's about a crime that takes place in the far north where it's light all day, and so instead of it being a film noir, a dark film, it's a film blanc or a blanche. My French isn't that good.
I think it's probably blanc, but
okay. Yeah, it would be because noir.
Yeah.
And it's set in the U.S. version. It's set in Alaska. Just get that same feeling of the 24-hour sun during the summer, the Arctic thing.
What a great setting.
Yeah, very strange, and the light is so electric during the
Yeah.
summer up there. So
It's interesting, actually, now that I think about it, that I'm just thinking that has there been a lot done with light and time in Scandinavian cinema? I mean, there must be. But,
absolutely.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
That one of the real bedrock themes.
I think if you could say one thing about at least films from, it's not so much the case with Danish films, but with films from all of the other Nordic countries, the natural environment is such a huge part of the films, and also of the literature, to be honest. It's not just a cinematic development, it's something we see from even the 19th century literature, that nature plays as much of a role, if not more, than people's interaction.
Well, at the risk of being wildly imprecise and generalizing, I mean, what does it do to people's psyches to be in a climate in which it's, well, describe it. It's dark, I guess in the wintertime it's just dark for how many months?
Well, of course, it depends on where you're at. But
Exactly.
if you're above the Arctic Circle,
Yeah.
say there's the city Tromsø.
Have you experienced this yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
In Tromsø in Norway, which has got the world's northernmost university, you have as much as 2 months where the sun doesn't come up over the horizon. And then in the summer, you have the opposite, where the sun never sets below the horizon, the midnight sun.
Yeah.
And it dramatically changes people's social interactions. You'll get people stopping by your house at 11 o'clock at night for a cup of coffee in the summertime. You know, and people just sit outside as much as they possibly can, as long as the weather's clear. The idea of going for a hike at midnight is just, people don't even think about it. It's quite a dreamlike state in the summer.
So it's dreamlike for a couple of months. And do people then feel, do they feel obliged to sleep? Or how many hours do people sleep?
In the summer?
In the summer.
You're so energized by the light and so giddy by the fact that you can actually get out.
So you only need, do you only need a few hours for those couple of months?
Well, no, I mean, people have jobs and have to go to work and stuff, so they have to have, you know, those blackout blinds. And they do a lot. And people who move up, or I mean, I've only visited, I haven't spent years in the far north, but they really, some people really have a hard time with the adjustment.
Right. And what about the winter?
Then you go to Spain.
You just get out. It's sort of Oregon plus as far as that goes.
So you go to Greece or Spain for your winter vacation.
So you can understand, I guess, again, why figurative space would be, I don't know, somehow, again, a very rich subject.
And one thing I forgot to mention about this author that's absolutely crucial, this Kura Sandal, is that she is from the very far north, in fact, in the city Tromsø that I mentioned.
I see.
And so a big part of the novel is the seasons cycles, and her relationship to the outdoor spaces is really crucial. So.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that. Tell me about some of your classes, so people out there are interested in sitting in.
Tell me. Well, we have
what you teach. You know, what kind of classes that you teach.
I teach a variety of courses. I teach a number of courses on Scandinavian literature, various topics. I teach a course on Scandinavian cinema, which is really exciting for me to teach. It's my favorite class to teach, I think. And I do some of the older directors, like Ingmar Bergman, and I also do Carl Theodor Dreyer, who's a sort of classic. Cinema buffs will know the name Dreyer for his Joan of Arc film, silent film. But I really focus a lot on films of the last 5 to 10 years and try to talk about contemporary Scandinavian identity formation and how Scandinavians imagine, sort of construct an imagined past, looking back at sort of the welfare state years and things like that.
Yeah. So that welfare state now is a thing of the past?
It's a work in progress. It's not
everyone. That's what everyone used to marvel at in the Scandinavian countries. Maybe romantically. I don't know.
I think somewhat romantically, and Scandinavians now are romanticizing over the loss of the true welfare state in some ways, in interesting ways. It's not completely gone, but privatization was a major factor in the political and economic development in the 1990s. So things like all the state control of, say, the oil and gas industry in Norway has been largely privatized.
I see. But I got you off topic. You were talking about the films of the last 5 or 10 years. So how do you get access to these films, and how do you? Do they all have subtitles?
Yeah.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
So what is the venue for these films then? Obviously, it's much broader than than the individual countries that produce them.
Right. One of the things that's changed about cinema a lot in the last 20 years is that it used to be sort of almost a cottage industry where a country would produce their own films for their own audience. And with globalization and internationalization, cinema is a totally transnational phenomenon now. And so you get distribution contracts, and I mean, there's a major world circuit with the cinema festival circuit. And so the main aim of these films, if they want to be distributed abroad, is to get into the festival circuit.
I see, yeah. So when you have this globalization, is there still an attempt on the part of the filmmakers to hang on to some kind of Scandinavian identity as something to sort of export to the global community?
Yeah, there's some that do that, and a good example, an early example of that would have been this Babette's Feast that I mentioned earlier, that's based on the Isaac Dinesen short story, where they're sort of, this is quintessentially Scandinavian, Lutheran in a way, but more and more I don't think they're trying for that. They're trying to market themselves as quirky and interesting in an international market where they're competing with everyone else. And I don't think they're so much focusing on presenting themselves as Scandinavian. But what I find with my students who, for example, don't get the humor, which I find these films hilarious, but my students, if I tell them that the films are funny, then they'll be mad at me because they don't laugh at the right places.
Do you think Bergman's funny also? Excuse my pronunciation.
Absolutely.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So those long silence?
Unintentionally.
That's different.
Yeah. I'm not sure how funny.
But these other films are intentionally funny.
Yeah.
But very understated.
Yeah, and very black humor. And in the Finnish sense, Finnish films are often it's very black humor, very understated.
And so, since you have all this interest in, why are you focusing on Norwegian as this next project? Since you seem to have this broad interest in film.
Just to see if I can say something interesting about it, if I can fit it into a larger discussion about what's happening in film right now. And it's not the best quality film in the world in each case, although I think there's some really fascinating, really interesting films produced in Norway. I'm just curious about what Norway is doing cinematically. So I'm not sure if that'll go anywhere.
Okay, well, I'm sure it will if you're the author. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
This flew by.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And we've been speaking today with Ellen Rees, an associate professor in the Department of Scandinavian Languages and Literature. Thank you for watching.